Hello, my name is Eric Hahn, and welcome to Shit I Have to Teach in 20 Minutes, a podcast for history teachers and anyone who wants a quick dose of history. Thanks for joining us today. In every episode, my colleague Rob Good and I interview an historian about their scholarship. We ask them to identify the most important concepts they think teachers should share with their students about the topic of the day. We also include a free lesson plan, almost always 2 lessons, that can be downloaded from the episode notes linked to this podcast. So, Rob, what's our focus for today?
Well, today we are discussing how to teach about the environment in a history course. Today's students are extremely interested in this topic, and it's one of the regrets that I have from my teaching practice that I did not emphasize environmental history enough in my course.
Yes, I'm sure you have regrets, many regrets, Rob. That's right.
Lots.
Yes. And who's our historian?
Today we welcome Dr. Michael Childers. Mike is an associate professor of history at Colorado State University, and he is the co-editor of the University of Nebraska series Environment and Region in the American West, and he is also the associate editor of the Western Historical Quarterly. His research interest explores the links between tourism and environmentalism in the American West, and the working title for his next book is The Mountains Are Calling: Tourists and the Unmaking of Yosemite National Park.
Exciting topic. Thanks, Mike, and welcome. So what we ask our historians every episode is, what would you say are the most important ideas about environmental history that teachers should teach and students should know?
All right. Well, thanks for having me, guys. And of course, like any long-winded professor, I could have 500 or 600 different points, but we'll boil them down to a couple of them for folks trying to get classes put together. First of all, environmental history is a really broad field, broad topic. Medievalists are environmental historians, folks who do world history of every place on the continent. You can do contemporary, you can do ancient. So this is an approach to history that a lot of historians of different time periods and topics use. So I'm going to just kind of focus in on my own subfield of the American West and tourism and national parks. But folks should be aware that they can use these sorts of ideas on virtually anything. Like we were discussing, if you're doing military history, battlefields are rich with this sort of ideas of environment. All right. So the big one that is kind of the binding thing for all historians, environmental historians, is nature has a history. Pretty straightforward. And that both nature, however we want to define it, and history are two incredibly dynamic and ever-changing things. And so they change together. So when you're looking at change over time, the real basic things, you can see how the world changes. Trees are cut down and turned into savannas at the same time that human history changes as empires rise and fall. So these are two things that are working in conjunction for environmental historians. Pretty basic idea there. So things like landscapes, climate, plants, animals, ecosystems are not simply static backgrounds, but are an active part of our history. And they change over time due to human interaction and also natural processes. So that's one. Two, ideas about nature have shaped history, have shaped policy, and have shaped nature itself. So this is the cultural understandings of nature. There's a fantastic book from the mid-'80s by a preeminent environmental historian named William Cronin called Changes in the Land. And it's something that a lot of folks should take a look at. I use it when I teach my social studies teachers and sort of stuff. And the basic premise of the book is that colonists, British colonists and Native Americans in the beginning of kind of the British colonial experiment in North America had different cultural understandings of the natural world around them. And those different understandings led them to act on the land differently, to use nature differently, and also then led to conflict and crises together. So, you have one group coming out of largely Northern Europe and England who are seeing it as places for agriculture and ownership of land, which is coming down from king on down. And a enormous array of indigenous folks who are don't see it the same property in the same way, have about 10,000 plus thousand years of interacting with these landscapes. And so they are using it in a much different way. They still are using it, which is an important aspect of all this. So that sort of thing is really foundational for all environmental historians, whether you're talking about different peoples or even in a more contemporary sense, when we're talking about the American West, um, things like water, and the history of water is a really good topic in which to engage students on. Plus, it gives you the lovely pun about how all water history is very, very dry. Or my personal favorite is I do a lot of damn jokes during these sort of lectures at the time. So if you're anything like me, a good dad joke really kind of makes things go.
Well, can I ask a question? Yeah, because I love the fact that you also are teaching pre-service social studies teachers about this, and Bill Cronin's work around these approaches. And I've noticed that there is a tendency. Oftentimes, you said they did use indigenous people did use the land to romanticize indigenous uses of the land. In framing a course, I was always concerned when I was teaching U.S. history, because what I predominantly taught was, I wanted to early on talk about the role of race, class, and gender, to talk about politics, but I didn't bring environmentalism in. Do you see that conflict point or not conflict, but difference between indigenous and European people's notions of the environment as a good starting point? And then, so my follow-up, because some U.S. history courses start, and obviously start pre-colonial, but some start around Reconstruction as well. Is there a starting point? If I was starting a class with Reconstruction, what would be a similar time period or concept to maybe bring up environmental history?
Sure. So the first thing I want to kind of correct, because this has been a misnomer since the beginning of the field, somewhere in the 1960s. Environmental history is not necessarily environmentalist history. So it doesn't have that activist sort of, it is putting nature into the story. Now, if you want to talk about environmental politics and environmental activism, that sort of stuff, that's clearly within bounds. But particularly a lot of contemporary historians are using it to talk about all sorts of different things. So that aside, I do agree that, when you're talking about the kind of the U.S. history, pre-contact to contact, there is a lot of different ways in which to think about the environment and how indigenous groups across the entirety of the North American continent interacted with their own environment. It wasn't like they were just sitting around waiting for a bunch of Europeans to show up. So you have everything from like Cahokia, and how it's an enormous city at one point in time that is larger than London contemporarily. And so it's the same sort of urban, they have sewage issues, they have trade issues, all those sorts of things, to even the use of water in the American Southwest by Puebloan peoples, and how they facing the same issues that we are today in that region, but of course at a different scale and different understandings of the world. If you want to move into like the second half of the survey, you're right. We usually start with Civil War, Reconstruction, this sort of thing. It's really a smart place to start with that, with the kind of environmental implications of slavery in the American South. Mm-hmm. The plantation system was incredibly destructive to the environment of the South, which is one reason why plantations slowly migrated from the eastern seaboard to eventually parts of Texas, and that's why one of the things that was pushing them prior to the war. But after the war, trying to recover both emotionally from the Civil War and environmentally from the impacts of this sort of system really is a great place to have those discussions about what are the implications of agriculture, what are the implications of slavery, what then are the connections between environment and race, which are right there within the grounds of Reconstruction. Then usually most people I launch off into then the conquest of the West after that. And that is full of ideas of natural resource extraction, and trying to grapple with a completely different sort of environment that is more arid, has different people, it's wider spaces. So those are two kind of places that I start with when I teach the second half of American history. And when teachers are looking at these things, always kind of look like, what are the environmental impacts of previous actions, and then how does that roll forward? So they can start anywhere within history in that regard.
Thanks. That's really helpful.
Mike, do you or your students have a topic, globalizing this a little bit outside of the United States, some sort of high interest topic in environmental history that you can think of? Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I know there are teachers out there who are going to want to be able to apply this in any given time period or some other space other than U.S. history.
Yeah. So, I also teach the World Environmental undergrad course here at Colorado State. And in a lot of ways, it's the same thing as a world history survey course at the college or at the high school level. And so it's, big, massive trends back and forth. You maybe get down to an individual story about once. But in those same sorts of things, thinking about human migration is really core and important. One of the kind of early environmental historians that set up the field, but also set up our construct of history was Crosby out of Texas. And his ecological imperialism is the basis of the idea of the triangular trade that we all not only learned in high school. I was in high school a moment and a half ago, but continues to be kind of the basis of that sort of stuff. And that's an environmental lesson, how we were moving things around the Atlantic Ocean, and it's a global trade system, and that has environmental implications in South America, in North America, in Europe, in Africa. So students usually kind of key on that kind of migration of goods and peoples and diseases and plants. And it's something easy for them to grapple with. One fun thing to really think about in that regard is food, because everybody likes food. And so how does food change? Like, how does the introduction of corn and potato to these different parts of this world change dietary habits? And, if you're so lucky, you might be able to have someone bring in something, or you have a kitchen or these sorts of deals. But food and drink. Obviously the transference of alcohol around the Atlantic basin is a big deal, but that may not be pertinent for a K through 12 kind of kids.
Well, Eric had this great lesson where he did cocoa but he made it much like with very little sugar and the kids would just like
yeah. Not Coke, by the way. It was
no. He left the industry early. He was fired for that, but no.
But that is great though. Yeah, we talked about Mexico and the use of the cocoa bean as I think it had monetary value actually because it was so scarce. All the chocolate went to priests.
Well, as we're kind of coming to a close, and just thinking about the fact that you're both teaching history and you're also working with pre-service teachers, maybe ending with sort of not necessarily a plea, but a push for bringing to not make the mistakes I made in my practice, realizing late in the career just how important this was for students. What do you say to your students about centering nature and the environment in their courses?
I would argue that it is equally as important as race, class, and gender. If you add environment, so you have 4 of them, that gives you as complete of a picture of the past as it. And so something environmental historians have been, arguing for a couple of generations now is that it is on par. And when you intermix environment with race or with class or with industry, you just add a really important dimension to history. And, in truth, in kind of the university level, when I go to conferences now, environmental history is almost everywhere. It's not as specialized with, it's just a handful of books. You couldn't possibly read all the books of environmental history in a lifetime at this point. So it's equally as important as race, class, gender.
Thank you, because and that's, hopefully we can address that in our practice and with the teachers that are listening. I'm sure that they're way ahead of where I was anyway. So that's because they've come up, and I think they've benefited from that scholarship as well. Eric, any last thoughts or questions?
Yes, very exciting topic. Thank you, Mike. And remember, you can download your free lesson from the link provided in the episode notes. Be sure to stay tuned after this brief song to hear a description of those lessons.
Oh no, the clock is ticking, 20 minutes, time is spinning, pulling facts from thin air, hope they think I came prepared.
Wow, I wish I had had a professor like Mike when I was in school, and it would have sure helped prepare me to provide information about environmental history that my students were hungry for. The lesson that I developed builds on his assertion that nature and the environment are as important as race, class, and gender as a category for historical analysis. And to help frame that at the beginning of a course, I developed a lesson from the colonial period where students will read and respond to 3 paragraphs from William Cronin's important book, Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England, a book that Mike talked about being very important in this discussion. The concluding discussion, after they've gone through all of the paragraphs and answered the questions, challenges students to rethink what they've learned, like the story of the first Thanksgiving, and to analyze it from an environmental perspective. Also, it opens up a discussion on how should we look at the nature and the environment through other episodes in the U.S. history. So how about you, Eric?
I'm sorry, are you finished? Oh my gosh. No, actually, that's very good. It's very good. Rob, great. Rob always has great lessons. I actually developed 3 environment themed history lessons. I agree that students are absolutely hungry for these kinds of lessons. The 3 topics are 2 of the 3 are about water. One's about deforestation. The ones on water are relatively dry. Just kidding.
Hey, by the way, he stole that joke from Mike Childers. So he's master teacher is a master thief. But
Mike, I'm giving you credit here right now. The first lesson developed was on ancient Sumer. In case anybody teaches about that, it was water rights issues between 2 Sumerian cities. The next lesson is on the British Raj in the 19th century in India. That has to do with deforestation. And then the last lesson is more modern with South Africa and how apartheid whites used water control against blacks in South Africa. That's it.
That's it's kind of a choose your own adventure for world history teachers. Yeah. That's wonderful. Well, thank you all for listening. And remember, you can download these free lessons from the link provided in the episode notes.
Or if you're not a teacher, don't
tell them what to do.
You don't tell me what to do.